Saudi Arabia has won the right to host the most prestigious event in world football. And when I say won, I mean bought. And when I say prestigious, what I really mean, of course, is shameless and hideously corrupt. In the least surprising news, since it turned out that this bloke was a bit of a wrong'un, Saudi Arabia has been awarded with the right to host the 2034 FIFA World Cup. The Gulf state, which has invested over $5 billion in sport over the last 2 years, was the only nation to bid for hosting rights, therefore being awarded with the World Cup unopposed. In addition to the 2034 World Cup, which is the nation's greatest sporting coup yet, and the 2023 FIFA Esports World Cup, which it has already hosted, Saudi Arabia will also host the 2023 FIFA Club World Cup, the 2024 Spanish, Italian, and Turkish Super Cups, and wants to host the 2035 Women's World Cup, despite Saudi Arabia's women's team only having been formed in 2022, women still being treated as second-class citizens in Saudi Arabia, and many women footballers having openly advocated for LGBT rights, something which is explicitly illegal in Saudi Arabia, where homosexual acts are still punishable by death. Soon enough, you won't be able to play a game of FIFA or have a kickabout with your mates without first boarding a flight to Riyadh after football has sold everything that it owns to the kingdom. But fear not, because the world's baldest fraudster Gianni Infantino says that you can rest assured that this is all making football more inclusive. Of course it is. What could possibly be more inclusive than selling football to one of the least inclusive nations on earth? It all makes perfect sense. Saudi Arabia's successful bid means that, in the space of 16 years and just 5 World Cup cycles, Russia, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia will each have solely hosted FIFA's showpiece event. Meanwhile, the only other hosts, namely the United States, Canada, and Mexico in 2026, and Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay in 2030, will see 2 tournaments spread out across 4 continents and 9 different countries, at least 6 of whom are far better equipped to host a World Cup on their own than either Qatar or Saudi Arabia. It is a curious state of affairs, or at least, it is until you understand how football is governed, at which point it all makes perfect sense. Most people are well aware that something dodgy must be going on here, and they would be quite right, but they perhaps don't know exactly what that something is or how it works. So in today's video, regrettably, in yet another trip to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where critics of the regime have an unfortunate habit of disappearing inside of consulates and being hacked apart with bone saws, we are going to take a look at the internal machinations of FIFA and its member associations, the ludicrous wranglings that prevented anyone else from bidding, and, ultimately, how Saudi Arabia bought the 2034 FIFA World Cup. Before we delve into the murky details of how Saudi Arabia bought the 2034 World Cup, it is worth establishing first how World Cup hosts are decided and what that process actually looks like. Any country, or in some instances more recently, group of countries, can bid to host the World Cup. The FIFA Council, which has 37 members and is led by FIFA President Gianni Infantino, then has the ability to scrutinise those bids. Once they have done so, all approved bids are put forward to the FIFA Congress, which is made up of the 211 member associations, who each have equal representation. That means that the vote of the US Virgin Islands or Guam holds the same weight as the vote of India, China, or 5-time world champions Brazil. The FIFA Congress's size and equal voting rights were established, ostensibly at least, to democratise decision-making by world football's governing body, and to prevent the organisation's internal leadership from being able to act like tin-pot dictators and make unilateral decisions. Hey, don't laugh, I said ostensibly that's what it was supposed to do, alright? The issue with the one-member, one-vote system is that most countries that are FIFA members, and there are actually 18 more members of FIFA than there are of the United Nations, are relatively impoverished, both in terms of those countries as a whole, but more pertinently in this instance, in terms of their football associations. Many of them, and their senior leadership are also very corrupt. That means that they are quite easily swayed in terms of which way to vote on any number of issues if there is a financial incentive to them voting a certain way. Sepp Blatter discovered this vulnerability in FIFA's voting process back in the 1990s and exploited it ruthlessly to become president in 1998 and to remain in post until he was removed, not by losing an election, but because he was banned from taking part in FIFA activities for 8 years by the FIFA Ethics Committee in response to FIFA's 2015 corruption case. The Swedish then UEFA president, Lennart Johansson, was the favourite to win the presidency and succeed João Havelange at the 51st FIFA Congress in 1998, but Blatter, allegedly, had an ace up his sleeve. According to David Yallop, writing in his 1998 book How They Stole the Game, Blatter enlisted the help of a Middle Eastern delegate who met with African delegates at the Meridian Montparnasse Hotel in Paris on the eve of FIFA's 51st Congress, and handed them envelopes each containing $50,000, supposedly as development money, in exchange for their votes. Blatter won the presidential election, narrowly, by 111 votes to Johansson's 80, which wasn't enough to win him a necessary supermajority and would have required a second vote, but sensing the way in which things were going, Johansson withdrew, allowing Blatter to become FIFA's 8th president. In 2012, Johansson, who died in 2019, went public with the long-rumoured allegations, calling for a FIFA inquiry into vote buying. Blatter actually accepted that there had been vote buying during the election.
Oh my god! He admitted!
But don't get too excited, because whilst Blatter acknowledged that vote buying had happened, he vehemently denied any suggestion that he had been involved. Presumably, Johansson, the strong favourite to win who ended up losing by 31 votes, paid African delegates $50,000 each in order to vote against him. You know, he just decided at the last minute that he didn't want the job after all, and that he actually hated football. Or something like that, I suppose. Either that, or someone did buy votes for Blatter, but he wasn't personally aware of it, and therefore couldn't personally be held accountable for his good fortune. Both takes seem more than a little fanciful, but Blatter had stumbled upon a successful formula, and, as I said, he ruthlessly exploited it for the next 17 years. If there is one thing that Blatter was very good at, other than enriching himself, it was making FIFA a much more lucrative organisation. Of course, those two went hand in hand, but they're not quite the same thing. FIFA's revenue rose from a few $100 million during a World Cup year, and a tiny fraction of that at any other time before Blatter, to more than $2 billion in Blatter's final World Cup cycle, which was 2014, and almost $1.5 billion even outside of a World Cup year in 2013. More money in FIFA's coffers means more money is distributed to its members, and that money is particularly important to smaller and less affluent confederations and associations. Even without the alleged brown envelopes and money on the side then, Blatter was a popular candidate among poorer member nations. And in 2011, at FIFA's 61st Congress, even after the awarding of the 2018 and 2022 World Cups to Russia and Qatar, and widespread allegations of corruption, Blatter was re-elected, this time with 90% of the vote. That stat does sound a little bit less impressive when you factor in the fact that no one stood against him, but that in of itself was telling. Blatter had crafted FIFA into his own personal fiefdom over decades, and the only person initially to rival his candidacy, Qatar's Mohammed bin Hammam, spent most of his brief campaign lauding Blatter and telling everyone what a great job he'd done. A bit like Vivek Ramaswamy with Donald Trump, for anyone who has been following the current Republican presidential primaries, before vowing not to run, bin Hammam that is, not Ramaswamy yet, calling Blatter a very good friend and throwing his full support behind him. Blatter himself was a little bit less complimentary, stating that FIFA would be plunged into a black hole if bin Hammam won the election, and that, quote, the ballot could lead to a seismic shift with irreversible damage, Quite simply, the survival of FIFA is at stake. End quote. Blatter won again in May 2015 at the height of FIFA's corruption case. Shortly before the election at FIFA's 65th Congress, several officials associated with FIFA had been arrested by the FBI in Zurich and were expected to be extradited to the United States to face various corruption charges. Even under those circumstances, literally 4 days before his forced resignation, Blatter still saw off the competition of his only rival, the Jordanian royal Prince Ali bin Hussein, by 133 votes to 73. When Gianni Infantino was elected FIFA president in February 2016, he did so on a mandate of reform. His landmark reform package was overwhelmingly approved by the FIFA Congress, as Infantino promised to make FIFA, quote, a true democracy and the World Cup bidding process fully transparent. Infantino's vision, he claimed, was to expand the FIFA Council and govern with strict rules and procedures. And in 2018, during the bidding process for the 2026 World Cup, Infantino actually delivered on some of those promises. Bid committees were mandated to produce written reports to FIFA documenting every single meeting that they had with a potential voter, as well as any other promotional activities involving their members, consultants, or politicians. It was a bureaucratic nightmare as far as both the Moroccan and North American bidding committees were concerned, but the vote itself passed largely without a hitch and with few complaints or allegations of corruption. The same cannot be said of the 2030 and 2034 World Cups. Over the last few years, as Saudi Arabia has begun investing an absolute fortune in a whole series of sports, they have been making sordid backroom deals with a whole raft of football associations, FIFA members, and even entire confederations without any oversight, let alone the kind of scrutiny Infantino promised in 2016 and, to a certain extent, delivered upon in regard to the 2026 World Cup. According to excellent reporting by Philippe Leclerc, Tim Röhn, and Benjamin Stibley, writing in the German newspaper Die Welt, Saudi Arabia has signed at least 41 Memorandums of Understanding, or MOUs, with football associations across the world since 2020, including one which was struck with Costa Rica when the Saudi Arabian Football Federation hosted the Central Americans just a couple of months ago. Saudi Arabia, naturally of course, hosted Costa Rica at the home of Saudi Arabian football. That's right, St. James's Park in Newcastle upon Tyne. Not only is the estimate of 41 associations having signed backroom deals and MOUs with the Saudis likely to be a severe underestimate, those are just the ones that we know about, the Saudi Arabian Football Federation has also struck deals with two entire confederations, namely the Oceania Football Confederation, or OFC, and the Confederation of African Football, or CAF. Given that the Asian Football Confederation, or AFC, which is the confederation that Saudi Arabia itself belongs to, is already in the kingdom's back pocket, with Bahraini AFC president Salman bin Ibrahim Al Khalifa effectively acting as a mouthpiece for Saudi Arabia's football endeavours at this point, it basically means that Saudi Arabia has already bought off half of world football's confederations. Africa and Asia are also the continents with the most countries in the world, and therefore, the AFC and CAF, the confederation with the most FIFA members. More members equals more votes. South America's confederation, CONMEBOL, might be home to 5-time World Cup winners Brazil, 3-time winners Argentina, and 2-time winners Uruguay, and have hosted the very first World Cup in 1930, and the second most tournaments overall after Europe, but it only has 10 member associations, and therefore only 10 votes, at FIFA's Congress. That is fewer than the OFC, despite the fact that the OFC is just New Zealand and a collection of tiny Pacific islands, none of whom, other than New Zealand, have ever even qualified for the World Cup. Even then, it's not as though Saudi Arabia doesn't have friends in high places in UEFA, CONCACAF and CONMEBOL. The Saudis own a football club in Europe, and the world's biggest league, the Premier League, who they have used to help promote their World Cup bid, their ties with the Spanish, Italian and Turkish football associations are so strong that they are literally hosting those countries' domestic Super Cups in Riyadh and Jeddah, and CONCACAF, as we have seen time and time again, is one of football's most easily corruptible confederations due to the high density of small and low-income island nations. There are 8 new associations who signed MOUs with Saudi Arabia in the space of just 2 weeks, including 2-time World Cup winners France, war-torn Syria, and Saudi Arabia's greatest geopolitical rivals and sworn enemies Iran. It shows how multipolar Saudi Arabia's football strategy is, and how varied the level of support that they have been able to harbour or acquire has been. The Saudis have now bought the support of at least 20% of FIFA's 211 Congress member associations, but they haven't stopped there. In July 2023, Saudi Arabia signed a deal with the Northern Mariana Islands. The Northern Mariana Islands are an extremely remote collection of 14 islands in the northwestern Pacific Ocean, previously under the control of the Spanish, the Germans, and the Japanese. Since World War II, the Northern Mariana Islands has been an unincorporated territory and Commonwealth of the United States. Home to fewer than 50,000 people, having witnessed a dramatic population decline since 2000, the Northern Mariana Islands aren't FIFA members. The Northern Mariana Islands Football Association itself was only founded in 2005, and the Northern Mariana Islands national football team are the newest members of the AFC, having been granted membership in 2020. Since then, the Northern Mariana Islands have played a grand total of 2 games, both friendlies against neighbouring Guam in February 2022, both of which ended in defeat. Over the last 25 years as a whole, in fact, the Northern Mariana Islands have only played 25 games, their only victory during that time coming against fellow non-FIFA members Macau in 2014. Nonetheless, the Northern Mariana Islands have applied for FIFA membership. Their applications have thus far been unsuccessful, but they haven't given up yet. And, clearly, nor has Saudi Arabia, who have deemed it worthwhile to strike up a deal with a tiny archipelago, just in case it ever gains a vote. Here's how it works, and, to be honest with you, it's not particularly complex. Saudi Arabia invests in stadiums and facilities, typically in poorer countries, or they say they're doing that while some corrupt official secretly pockets all the cash. Saudi Arabia doesn't care much either way, it makes no bones to them, and in return, those poorer or smaller countries, whether that be Mauritius, Liberia or Malawi, lend Saudi Arabia their votes. One former manager of a successful World Cup bid described the process as, quote, a completely legal form of bribery. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call the beautiful game, and don't you ever forget it. If you watched my documentary about how Qatar won the right to host the 2022 World Cup, you could be forgiven for thinking that some of this sounds awfully familiar. And you'd be quite right. But there are some key differences. Saudi Arabia's approach to investing in football has been much more extensive. Of course, we all know about the 80% ownership in Newcastle United, the 4 PIF-owned and operated Saudi Pro League clubs, and the more than $1 billion that they have spent on signings over the last 12 months, handing the likes of Ronaldo, Benzema and Neymar Jr. contracts which are without precedent in the entire history of world football. But there is lots of Saudi money in football that is a lot less clearly signposted or just otherwise goes ignored. A very good recent report authored by Stanis Ellsborg and published by Play the Game detailed 795 positions in 156 Saudi entities and more than 300 Saudi sponsorship deals throughout world sport, several of which open up some fairly serious conflicts of interest. Saudi Arabia's primary sponsors are Salah, a Saudi Arabian experiences and events firm which just so happens to be owned by PIF, as is 50% of the Saudi e-commerce platform Noon, who are the Toon's shirt sleeve sponsors. Saudia Airlines, meanwhile, which is owned, like PIF, by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, recently became Newcastle's official airline partner, reportedly paying £3 million a season for that privilege. Surprisingly enough, Newcastle apparently didn't even have an official airline partner before Saudia came along, but one would assume that those negotiations must have been pretty fierce. At least Saudia is actually an operational airline though. Atletico Madrid's shirt sponsors this season, Riyadh Air, which is also owned by PIF and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as being chaired by Newcastle United chairman Yasser Al-Rumayyan, is paying €40 million a year to sponsor Atletico Madrid, despite the fact that the airline doesn't exist yet. Riyadh Air is the planned second carrier of Saudi Arabia, currently has 0 operational aeroplanes and 0 destinations, though it has apparently placed an order for 39 Boeing 787-9s. Saudi Arabia hopes that the airline will begin operations in 2025 and, presumably, just felt like sponsoring Spain's third biggest football club before the company is operational would be a smart business decision, something that, lots of perfectly normal companies do under perfectly normal circumstances, and there is definitely nothing to see here. Move along now. La Liga itself is also sponsored by the Kingdom via Visit Saudi, who are one of the league's 8 global partners along with Puma and San Miguel, in a deal worth €20 million a season. That is despite the fact that La Liga's president Javier Tebas, who is best known for accusing Vinicius Jr. of being manipulated after the Brazilian complained about being racially abused, and for voicing his support for Spain's far-right political party Vox, previously criticised the Royal Spanish Football Federation for moving the nation's Super Copa to Riyadh. At the time, Tebas pointed out that Saudi Arabia has a dreadful human rights record, uses sport as a way of cleansing its international image, and that money shouldn't be the only thing that matters to the RFEF. In fairness to Tebas, that was all the way back in 2021. Hey, people can change an awful lot in 2 years. There is another way in which Saudi Arabia's 2034 World Cup bid differs from Qatar's successful bid to host the tournament in 2022, and that is in terms of the pretense of an open bidding process. When Qatar were chosen as hosts in 2010, along with Russia, they saw off the competition of rival bids from the United States, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. Although Saudi Arabia claims to have the support of over 100 countries, suggesting that they may have signed far more than just 41 backroom deals, and meaning that they would almost certainly have won the most votes in any World Cup bidding process, this time around, FIFA removed any doubt whatsoever. They did so, as I explained in far greater detail in a recent video about how the 2030 World Cup is already a total mess, but will summarise now by skipping the voting process entirely. Saudi Arabia had initially bid to host the 2030 World Cup along with Greece and Egypt, despite the fact that they ought not have been eligible, as per FIFA's own rules, because Qatar hosted in 2022 and confederations are only supposed to be able to host one World Cup every 12 years. Nonetheless, Saudi Arabia still bid, and having become FIFA's best friends in recent years, they and Infantino really wanted them to win. The 2030 World Cup would have been a bit too on the nose though, even for FIFA, just 8 years after Qatar hosted. It would mean a wait of at least 20 years for a South American nation, or nations, to host, and at least 28 years for a nation or nations that are wholly or even predominantly in Europe to host, despite South America and Europe still being the dominant forces in world football, and the latter still FIFA's biggest cash cow in terms of broadcast deals. FIFA's elegant solution, as it has been described, has been to spread the 2030 World Cup out across 3 different continents. No, not countries, 3 different continents, handing 3 token group games to 3 South American nations for the World Cup centenary, and forcing Africa to function as a chess piece, hosting alongside Portugal and Spain. That means that UEFA, CAF, and CONMEBOL nations are all ineligible to host in 2034, plus CONCACAF having hosted in 2026, even if that exact same rule didn't seem to apply to Saudi Arabia when they initially bid to host in 2030. Given the fact that the OFC is just New Zealand and small island nations, it meant that the 2034 World Cup could only be hosted by an AFC nation or nations. Within 65 minutes of FIFA announcing their incredibly convoluted and stupid 2030 World Cup plans, Saudi Arabia announced their official bid to host in 2034, and big-name Saudi Pro League signings like Karim Benzema, Riyad Mahrez and Jordan Henderson took to social media with their carefully choreographed messages of support for the Saudi bid. As soon as Saudi Arabia tabled their official bid, and I really do mean as soon as, the AFC's Bahraini president Salman bin Ibrahim Al Khalifa, bearing in mind that the AFC is the only confederation able to bid in 2030 due to FIFA's wranglings, threw his weight behind the Saudi bid. At the same time, FIFA brought forward the deadline for submitting a bid to host the 2034 World Cup by 3 whole years, meaning that the new deadline would end in just 27 days. The only remaining problem, perhaps, was FIFA's recently implemented requirement that any potential World Cup host have 14 suitable stadiums, half of which, so 7, must be existing stadiums, in order to prevent a repeat of Qatar, which had practically no existing stadiums, before hosting the World Cup. That presented a bit of a problem because Saudi Arabia only currently has 1 stadium, which would be deemed suitable by FIFA's standards, and would struggle to build 7 that could be considered existing stadiums before hosting the World Cup. FIFA, therefore, came up with another elegant and ingenious solution, namely to just change the rules on the eve of Saudi Arabia lodging their bid, reducing the number of required suitable existing stadiums from 7 to 4. It was incredibly fortuitous for Saudi Arabia and Gianni Infantino's close friend, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. A real cynic might even suggest that the whole thing stinks of a stitch-up. Not me, of course. I have every faith in FIFA's due process, but a cynic, well, they could be forgiven for being left with that impression. It takes an awful lot of time and money to launch a World Cup bid. In 2010, Australia spent £26 million on their bid to host in 2022 in return for receiving just a solitary vote. That would seem odd, under normal circumstances, given that Australia has never hosted the World Cup and would appear to be very suitable hosts, but of course, Qatar had already bought enough votes to make the whole thing a total waste of time. Undeterred, Australia still expressed an interest in hosting in 2034, as did Indonesia, despite FIFA implementing such a tight deadline for bids to be submitted. When they did so, however, they received a less than welcome response from both FIFA and their own confederation, the AFC. Gianni Infantino's attempts to dissuade both Australia and Indonesia from bidding weren't particularly subtle, as he publicly urged the presidents of all AFC federations to be, quote, united for the 2034 World Cup. Infantino's dear friend and brother Sheikh Salman, and those are his words, not mine, went one step further, explicitly calling for unanimous support for Saudi Arabia's bid from all AFC members. Under ordinary circumstances, you could at least make a case for confederations calling for unity. If an AFC bid were going up against, let's just say, a UEFA or CONMEBOL bid, presenting a united front from an entire continent and confederation could make some sense in terms of providing good optics and, potentially therefore, making the AFC bid more likely to come out on top. Given that the AFC was the only confederation able to host the 2034 World Cup though, and therefore, whichever bid received the most votes from all 211 members of the FIFA Congress, an AFC nation or nations was guaranteed to host, the only explanation for Infantino and Sheikh Salman's attempts to dissuade Australia and Indonesia from bidding, just as with the bizarre format and host selection for the 2030 World Cup, is that they wanted to pave the way for Saudi Arabia to seamlessly be selected as hosts without any competition. This is what FIFA, attempting to gaslight football fans worldwide, calls constructive dialogue and extensive consultation. A reminder, at this stage, that Infantino was elected FIFA president on a promise of transparency and true democracy. If nothing else, Infantino has delivered on one of those promises. The 2034 World Cup bidding process is the most transparent of all time. Much more so than Russia and Qatar in 2010, FIFA could not have made it any more clear or obvious that they had decided who would host the World Cup before the bidding process had even begun, and they're not even denying it. Maybe it's an appropriate time to relook at how we do it. CONCACAF president and FIFA vice president Victor Montagliani told the Sport Unlocked podcast last month, speaking of a need for FIFA to make the World Cup bidding process a lot more corporate and an executive decision in a smaller body like the FIFA Council. Saudi Arabia, therefore, has spent the last couple of years buying the votes of football associations, but it hasn't even required those votes to host the World Cup due to the extraordinary lengths that FIFA has gone to in order to ensure that Saudi Arabia was unopposed in 2034. One of the claims that FIFA likes to make about itself is that even when it awards major tournaments to brutal and repressive regimes like Saudi Arabia, where criticising the House of Saud is punishable by death, there are mass executions, and children are tortured into providing false confessions, is that they are still a force for good. Because the World Cup bidding process and the prestige that hosting a World Cup affords provides them with the necessary leverage to bring about real reforms. We heard this a lot in Qatar, most of it total nonsense of course, in relation to civil liberties and workers' rights. Even if it were true though, which it obviously wasn't, FIFA has openly removed any leverage that it claims to have by gifting Saudi Arabia the World Cup without so much as a bidding process at all. In 2013, then FIFA Secretary-General Jerome Valk made the awkward admission that, quote, less democracy is sometimes better for organising a World Cup. If that's true, then the 2034 World Cup should be the best yet, at least as far as FIFA's concerned. That is it for today's video. There was loads more that I had planned, including issues around stadiums, logistics, climate, scheduling, Saudi Arabia's grander football plans and relationships with the FIFA Club World Cup as it looks to rival the Champions League, and the weasel words of that weasel-faced ghoul Eddie Howe, but alas, this video would be at least a couple of hours long, so I tried to stick to the title of the video for once, and we'll just have to save those for another day. Thank you all anyway very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it or found it interesting. Enjoyed might be the wrong word. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel, HITC 7s, and also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC7s on all three, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.